Aloha kako. Welcome everybody to tonight's Kanakanology show. We are so pleased to have Dr. Ron Williams return as our guest this evening. Ron is a historian for the Hawaii State Archives and is going to share some Mana'oan insight to some of our history, especially regarding the events around the overthrow, I believe. Okay, Ron, mahalo for coming.
Yeah, aloha mai.
Aloha.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to come share with you guys, and your audience. Yeah, so today, yesterday was the anniversary of the overthrow, obviously. And so I want to touch on that today. That said, the history and the story of the overthrow is fairly well known in the community, and most of the facts that have come out are pretty correct. So I want to use that. I want to use the overthrow as a way to get to including Native Hawaiians in that story. And what I mean by that is, Noinoi Silva said years ago in her book, she said one of the most pernicious myths about Hawaiian history is that Hawaiians didn't fight back. Haunani Kay used to talk about how she was on a panel years ago, and one of the panelists said that, well, Hawaiians gave up and they didn't really put up a fight, right? And that gives us a narrative of Native Hawaiians that carries forward to today, right?
Right.
There's a Pacific historian, I forget his name at the moment, but he wrote a book that talks about called Fatal Impact. And the idea was that, and it was meant to be, on the Native side. But what he talked about was that the white man went throughout the Pacific, and as he did, brown people fell by the wayside and the whites took over, right? Now there's truth to that history in a way, in the way that, yes, whites took over the Pacific, but the Native people didn't just stand by and watch it happen. They fought and they claimed their space and so forth. They fought successfully many times. So when we think about that story of January 17th, there's so much kamaha there, and there's so much unease there and pain there. But I think it also needs to be an opening point for us to start to rediscover the stories of Kanakaʻiwi women and men that are incredible, that talk to us about resilience and courage and dedication and victory. Hawaiians defeated a treaty of annexation twice in history. The only reason folks like Keanu Sai and myself and many others today can sit here and talk about annexation and no annexation is because of the work of those Kanakaʻiwi in that time.
Right.
So there's lots and lots of history that is, a lot of it's been discovered, but we've touched the tip of the iceberg. There's so many stories out there that talk to us of these resilient Kanakaʻiwi. And not only does it give us, as I speak of us as myself as a human being, but also specifically Kanaka Maoli as Hawaiians, it gives us and them stories to kind of invigorate our spirit and keep us going, but it gives the kids something to look up to and to make an example of. Right. There's, the project I worked on for the Native Hawaiian Patriot Cards picked out 10 folks. There's hundreds of stories from every neighbor, from Hilo to, Lihue to Lahaina to Wailuku to Hana. In every one of those towns, there were committees, there were dedications, there were organizations, there were men and women who led. And so as much as it's important to grieve, it's also important to find Kanakaʻiwi agency, is what we call it in academia, right? This activity that we can be inspired by. And so I want to talk about that tonight also. Okay, I'm going to flip on a light really quick because I'm in the dark pretty much here, but 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, so I think this is especially important as an educator.
Not much, but oh well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go over the facts of the overthrow really quickly. As I mentioned, most folks today, when I see stories come out and I see people talking in groups and Facebook, most of the information is correct, and that's great. I mean, that's one of the points in Hawaiian history where we've overcome the false narrative that was implanted in the history books and in folks' minds. So to run through it, 1887 was the real jumping off point, right? 1863, we'll back up a little further. 1863 was when the ABCFM in Boston, the mission, the American Protestant Mission, said that they've succeeded in Christianizing the nation, and now the missionaries should come home. And it's important to note that that mission was Congregationalist. It was Congregationalist and Presbyterian. And the Congregationalists felt like it should be a local, the whole point in Congregationalism is local power, right? They wanted to get away from Catholics where everything was centralized. And so they created this mission, and they told their missionaries, now come home, this should be a native-run, native-led church, right? But many of the sons and grandsons of the original missionaries had gotten positions of power, had gotten land and so forth. They didn't want to go home. They liked their place here. And so they had to come up with a new mission. They had to come up with a reason that they should still be in charge. And so they started to incorporate those ideas that they had learned in college back in New England and so forth in the 1850s and 60s, which were manifest destiny and Darwinism and so forth. And so you see race come into play in 1863 as a major factor. And so these sons and grandsons of the mission are now leaders of industry. They're growing wealthy, and they see it as their place, God's given right to run Hawaii. And so they start to plan that. 1876, 77, you start to see them organize more and more. Fast forward to just before the Bayonet Constitution, and you see them create a group called the Hawaiian League. Yeah, the Hawaiian League was an all-white secret organization, underground organization that was put together to create white power in Hawaii, to take rule from the natives in Hawaii. We have their constitution, the Hawaii State Archives. We have their member list. It's all there. And they needed so they had this group.
Rifle club? Is this around the same time as that rifle club?
I'm sorry?
The rifle club?
Oh, yes. So the Honolulu Rifles. Well, the Honolulu Rifles, the ironic thing is the Honolulu Rifles was originally a group set up to protect the kingdom. It was founded in the 1850s by the king as a group because there was no national army. And so the Honolulu Rifles was this well-trained private organization that could be called out by the king to put down like sailor riots and so forth. So it was kind of a private army used by the kingdom. It had fallen apart and kind of been disbanded when this Hawaiian League formed. They reformed it, let everyone know what the new purpose was, and that became their army, the Honolulu Rifles. And the Honolulu Rifles was 400, 500, 600 folks. And so they moved from that Hawaiian League and with that military arm to perform the first coup, which was 1887. They bring a constitution to Kalakaua. They say, sign this or we're going to kill you. And he signs it. And there were two factions of that Hawaiian League. There was the Dole faction and there was the Thurston faction. Dole was a constitutional lawyer. He was, at that point at least, still worried about like legal ways to do things and so forth. Thurston was the hot-headed, very racist guy who just wanted to get rid of the Kanaka. And so he wanted to kill Kalakaua and declare a republic and be the Republic of Hawaii under white control. The Dole faction won out and they ended up presenting this constitution to Kalakaua. But the idea was literally, we'll make this constitution so ridiculous that he'll refuse to sign it. Then we can kill him, take over, and we'll rule. In a way, you can say he kind of foiled their plan by signing it because he remained in power and he remained kind of a thorn in their sides. He used what little power he had to still fight back and so forth. And this is where the seeds to what I'm going to talk about later happen. This is when Kanakaʻiwi realized they had always been engaged in politics. They had always been aware. But this was the point when they realized the nation was really under duress. And that's when they formed the first political organization of Native Hawaiians, and that was Hui Kalai Aina. Yeah? So Hui Kalai Aina starts as a group coming out of the Bayonet Constitution to say, we as Kanakaʻiwi need to band together and vote together and so forth, because there's still going to be elections. And Hawaiians are still the majority of folks in Hawaii. And so that Hui Kalai Aina is the first kind of patriotic group that's looking to, and their main goal, they say in their constitution, is replace the Bayonet Constitution. Yeah. And
that was Maka'ainana as well in this group, or is that more of the higher class, like ruling class?
It was both. It was like Hui Aloha Aina, there were officers and there were a ruling class, but there was definitely Maka'ainana. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome.
It was one of the gentlemen the vice president was a man named John Alapa'i. And the way that the churches tie into it, and I write this in my dissertation, is that Alapa'i, like many of the men, were trustees at their churches. And so he becomes the vice president of Hui Kalai Aina. He's fighting politics and politics and politics. And so the church, this is Kaumakapili Church, So the pastor at Kamakapili Church, Reverend Waiamau, was a staunch pro-annexationist. He was for the overthrow and those types of things. And so he comes out with his power and he tries to excommunicate Alapa'i because his wife is a witch. She's a kahuna la'au, and she's performing, giving out. And so the church says that she's a witch, and they try to kick him out of the church. So,
oh my gosh.
yeah, so these types of things are going on. So it's becoming this really heated battle. Hawaiians still have quite a bit of power. In that 1890 and 1892 election, Hawaiians win several seats, and men like William Punahou White in Lahaina and Joseph Navahi in Hilo, they push the idea of a constitutional convention. So let's create a new constitution. They get just not enough votes, just barely not enough votes. And so that constitutional convention never happens. So there's two ways to create that new constitution. One is through a constitutional convention, and one is through a declaration of the monarch with the support of her cabinet, right? Now, the cabinet, the queen is under kind of duress because she's under this bayonet constitution, but she does have a little bit of power, and she manages to maneuver to bring in a cabinet that is willing to listen to her arguments. Even Albert Francis Judd says, the Supreme Court Justice says, the bayonet constitution is heavily flawed. And so William Punahou White and Joseph Navahi go to the queen and they say, this is the new plan. You're gonna proclaim a new constitution. The cabinet will agree to it, and we'll have the return of Kanaka power in Hawaii. And she admits in her own biography that she was reticent to do this. She wasn't sure it was the right time. She wasn't sure it could be accomplished, but she says White and Navahi kind of convinced her that it could happen. And this is a really incredibly important point, and along with what I'm going to say in a minute, because one of the narratives that justifies the overthrow for the Haole side is that the queen had supposedly taken on this idea of creating a new constitution for her own good. She wanted to claim more power. She was being greedy with power. She was demanded of a new constitution by her people, by her constituents. And she wasn't sure she wanted to do it, but they were saying, this is what you need to do. And so she went, and she says, the voice of the people is the voice of God. And so she ends up following up on that voice. So 1890, 1891, 92, we have this kind of push for Kanaka Uivi saying, no, we need to have one person, one vote. We need to protect native power, but also foreign citizens. When the queen goes on her trip around the islands in 1891, at every island, she's brought forth petitions, physical petitions, and these are from Hui Kalai Aina. One of the things that I hope that people gets out and people understand is that when we talk about petitions and petitions against annexation, everyone thinks about the Ku'e petition of 1897. That was one of dozens of petitions that Kanaka Uivi made, dozens of petitions by different groups that demanded their rights and their power. And the more we look at those other petitions, not only do we see a kind of a universal claim, but we also see, on a real practical note, we also see all those signatures that we hadn't seen before, right? I've had so many people ask me, come kind of a little kamaha and say, hey, my kupuna's signatures aren't on the annexation petition. And I have to tell them that, well, that was one. The Hui Kalai Aina petition against annexation had 11,000 signatures, and we don't know where it is today. It's gone. It was lost. So and I'll get to that in a second. But and all these other petitions we do have. I remember when I was looking for that petition that the Queen writes about the petitions that asked for a new constitution in 1891. She writes about it in her book, but they hadn't been discovered, or they weren't known about very well. So I was looking for them, others were looking for them. And I remember asking, I won't use his name for the moment, but there was a very, very well-known bibliographer in Hawaii who is very published and astute and knows quite a bit about Hawaiian history. I asked him about this petition. He said, he goes, that's, the Queen was always talking about stuff like that, it doesn't exist. Well, about 2 months later, a Kanaka Uivi colleague of mine, and I wish to gosh I could remember her name. This was years ago. She was in my Olelo class at Manoa. She found them in the state archives, the actual petitions. And we have those pages at the state archives today. There's 6,000 signatures in 1891 of a Hui Kalai Aina petition that demanded a new constitution of the Queen, right? So right there, you have primary source evidence that narrative of the queen pushing for a new constitution for her own good is ridiculous. The people demanded it. Yeah. So Huikalaina brings her new constitution. They actually, bring it to her in sheaves. We have this pushback. So now, as the missionary party or the white business party is seeing Kanaka's action, they're getting nervous and saying enough is enough. We've made money, we've got some power, but we can't keep messing around with having to get over the hump of these native leaders and so forth. And so they decide at that point to completely take charge. That's when they start working with Minister Stevens in 90 and 91 to plot the 93 overthrow. Okay. So we move into 93. The Queen has said, word has gotten out that this proclamation is going to happen, the new constitution. She's gotten her cabinet to agree to it. They've all said, yes, we'll sign it. That morning, the first thing she does is she meets with William Punahou White of Lahaina and Joseph Navahi of Hilo in the blue room of the palace, and she knights them, Knights Order of Kalakaua. And those were the last royal orders ever given out in the kingdom. And that was Sunday morning, January 14th, 1893. And she says, I give this to these two men because for writing this new constitution, for bringing our nation back to where it should be. She's got to do business. She's got to go across the street and end the 1892 legislature. It's a big formal ceremony. And then she's going to come back and meet in the blue room, get the constitution signed, go out on the balcony and tell the people, and everyone's going to be ecstatic. There's about 7,000 Native Hawaiians gather on the lawn of the palace, waiting to hear that after so many years, the power is going to be returned to the people. They're dressed in their Sunday best. They've got their top hats, their suits, the women in their dresses. The Queen goes to the legislature building. She prolongs the legislature. All the diplomats are there and so forth. And as she leaves the legislature building, Huikalaina is set up there in their dress. They've got their flag. They've got the actual constitution. And John Alapa'i is the man carrying it. And he's going to lead the Queen over to the palace carrying the constitution. So if you can imagine this act, this is, it's like 1776. It's Hawaiians saying, we once again, they've never lost sovereignty, and they've never lost that, but once again, we're going to have a legitimate constitution. They go over to the palace, they part through the people, they get inside, and the Queen says, okay, and she presents the constitution to her cabinet, and two of the cabinet members back out and say, we cannot sign. Because they had been pulled aside the day before into the law offices of Lauren Thurston and explained what was happening on that side. And that side was planning the coup. And they told these gentlemen, we're going to take over the nation and you don't want to be on the wrong side. And there was even a hesitancy. The two men said, well, how are you going to do this? And they said, well, we have the backing of the US troops. He said, I don't believe you. They had they had John Soper, who was one of the marshals of the kingdom. And they had Stevens and Wiltz come to the meeting and say, yes, the US is going to back this move. With that said, those two ministers knew that, what was going to happen. They still should have stuck by their guns, but they didn't. They backed out and they refused to sign the oath, the new constitution. So the Queen was kind of stuck. Now she could have at that point just declared the constitution like they did in 87. She could have just done like in say 1864. But
right, just like King Lot, he was just like, that's okay, it's done. Yeah.
She could have done that, but that's the interesting point about it is she wanted to do it legally. She wanted to do it even under the rules of the 1887 Constitution because she wanted it to last. She didn't want this to go back and forth all this times. So she said, no, we'll make this work. So she goes out on the balcony of the palace and she has to explain to the people that she cannot give them the constitution that she has now, but it will happen soon. Right? Things back off. The next day you have the 15th. That was a Saturday. So on Sunday, what happens on Sunday? That's kind of a side note that's really interesting. On Sunday, on the Sunday at the palace, she invites a non-denominational ecumenical council to the palace for a prayer meeting. She has the Anglicans, she has the Catholics, she has the Calvinists, she has all of them come to the palace for a prayer meeting. And she says in her journals later, while I was sitting there praying for peace and unity, the missionaries were plotting my overthrow. Right?
Yeah.
So they're there doing that. The U.S. troops are landed on January 16th. The 17th comes, they declare the provisional government around 1:30. The supposed bloodless revolution in which the Hawaiian policeman was shot, Aloha was shot. By the way, kind of an odd fact, but we have the gun that shot him at the State Archives.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those it's one of those things about history. Where you
Somebody's like, let's save this. Like,
but it is historical, you know. I mean,
yeah,
and it's important because still to this day you hear bloodless revolution. I'm like, well, tell that to him, right? It wasn't a bloodless revolution, but nonetheless, the overthrow happens. They declare themselves a provisional government. Okay, so with that said, the one thing that I continue to see that I'd like to offer a correction to, and it's some people will say, oh, it's a little deal, but it's so important that we use the correct terminology when we describe these things, and it's so important that we use context to understand these things. The Committee of 13. There was an article written in the Hawaiian Journal of History last year that's really a good article that lays it out in 40 pages. But I'll summarize. The Committee of 13. It's factually incorrect to say a group of American businessmen overthrew the kingdom. These weren't American businessmen. There were a majority of Hawaiian Kingdom subjects. There were 6 Hawaiian Kingdom subjects, 5 American citizens, 2 British subjects, and 1 German subject, right? Now, that's not saying that America wasn't involved. It's not saying America didn't use troops. It's not saying America didn't steal the nation. It's just being clear about what happened and it's important to do that because it gives us a look at, there were these gentlemen who had sworn allegiance to the Kingdom of Hawaii.
Right.
Lauren Thurston, those folks were born and raised in Hawaii. Most of them had never been to America. Now, I'm not saying they didn't have American influences. I'm not saying they didn't have what I'm saying is
but it's saying that they were betraying their own nation.
Exactly.
And it's different. It's different than an outsider coming and conquering. It's these ones that there was a sense of true betrayal.
Exactly. And we have, so it's easy to get caught up in this anti-American, well, America overthrew the Queen. American troops. But the guys who led the overthrow the majority of them were Hawaiian Kingdom subjects. Right? You're talking about folks who betrayed their own country. So that's an important clarification to get correct. That it wasn't American businessmen. It was a group. The term I use, the commonality between all these guys is that they were white. This was very much about race. This was a group of white men, businessmen, and former missionary sons and so forth. And it wasn't missionaries. None of those guys were missionaries. They were descendants of missionaries. But it was a group of white men looking to take over a brown nation. Okay? And so they do that in 1893. Which leads us to this idea of agency. So how did Hawaiians react to that? What did they do? When we see Blount come, and we see the Blount report come out, and we see the President of the United States say this was an act of war committed by a representative of the United States repudiates Stevens's actions, it fires him, it appoints a new minister, and Cleveland sends Willis to restore the Queen. Okay?
Right.
So at that point, the Queen meets with Willis, they agree on it, they make an agreement eventually, and so forth. And so at that point, another thing that people tend to conflate is that 1893 is the same as 1898. It's not. 1893 isn't the same as 1894. At the end of 1893, December 1893, the US minister goes to the provisional government and says, you need to step down and let this Queen come back to power. At that point, the 2 factions come up again, Dole and Thurston. Dole guys say, well, I guess we lost. U.S. is a powerful nation, I guess we lost. As long as we get an agreement that we're not going to be punished, then I guess we'll give in. And Thurston says, no way. He says, I think they're bluffing. I think if we stand up and say we're not leaving, the President of the United States is not going to give the power of U.S. military to fire on and shoot white guys to bring back a brown Queen. And unfortunately, he's right. The president did not give the U.S. troops military power to restore the Queen. And so Thurston's gambit, his bluff, was correct. And so they say, no, we're not stepping down. Bug off. And they say specifically to the United States, where they've been begging the United States for annexation, now they say this is an internal domestic matter. It's none of your business. So So at that point, in late 1893, 1894, America becomes the enemy of the Republic, of what's going to become the Republic, right?
Right, because America wanted to disenfranchise the public. They wanted to disrupt
Official
it.
policy was restoration. Yes, there were people,
Right.
and so forth, but that's so important to understand because it wasn't this just narrative from 93 to 98. It was America enabling the overthrow, then trying to correct it, but not going all the way, and then stealing the nation in 1898. That was America's role. It wasn't to take over 93 and then go on. So 1893, late 1893, 1894, the provisional government realizes that they need to form a serious government. A provisional government. So one of the things that, I need to back up. The first treaty of annexation was defeated by, we always credit Cleveland, right? He came into power, pulled the treaty from Congress, and it died.
Right.
I didn't even know this until a year ago, so semi-recently, was that it wasn't that he saw the situation and thought, well, the just thing to do, because that's what I was always taught. He said, we need to investigate what happened. But he did that because he was prodded. Who prodded him? Hui Hawaii Aloha Aina.
Wow.
And I didn't know this until I found the petition. So in March the 4th, 1893, Joseph Navahi, John Adams Kuakini Cummins, and other men meet at Arion Hall in Honolulu. Arion Hall is across the street from the palace, or used to be. You know where the post office is there?
Yeah.
Well, on the Leahi side, on the Diamond Head side of the post office, there used to be the Opera House, Honolulu Opera House. Right behind it was a big hall called Arion Hall, and that's where all the big meetings were held. So today it's the back Diamond Head side of the post office. And so Navahi and those guys meet there, right across the street from the palace, and they form Ka'ahui Hawaii Aloha Aina. Today we also call it Hui Aloha Aina, but it's Ka'ahui Hawaii Aloha Aina. So they formed this group to stop annexation and to preserve independence of the nation, right? That's on March the 4th. On March the 7th, 3 days after they organized, they sent a telegram to the President of the United States saying, before you do anything, before you make any decisions, you need to understand the truth and you need to launch an investigation. And that's why Cleveland brought in Blount. It was because these organized, dedicated, intelligent Hawaiians sent a telegram and told him to.
That's so important. That's so important because then it's not this white savior thing going on.
Yeah.
Where the president was so graceful and he decided to be just. Like, no, there was Kanaka fighting for their rights from the beginning.
That's such an important point to make because, like I said, I up until very recently, I thought, well, Cleveland saw the situation and thought he should do the right thing. No, he was prodded to do so by Kanaka Oiwi.
Right.
So they start Hui Aloha Aina on March 4th. On March 27th, so at that point, Hui Aloha Aina is going to grow to be about 8,500 members, which is the largest Kanaka Oiwi political organization in history to that point, right? 3 weeks later, on March 27th, at the same hall, the women come together. And Mrs. Navahi and Mrs. Cummins and Mrs. McFarland and others, and they form the ladies, which is the official name. Hui Hawaii Aloha Aina Ame Kuakoa Ana Lady. Yeah, that was the official name. And so, but the important
say that again 3 times fast.
was Hui Hawaii Aloha Aina Ame Kuakoa in independence Ana Lady of the women. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So the important point about this, and Noe Silva made this point several years ago, was that this wasn't a branch of the men's organization. This was its own organization. This was its own organization. And these women quickly surpassed that claim that the men had 3 weeks earlier. They became the largest political organization in Hawaiian history. The women's group had over 11,500 women in the group. And that's today. I mean, I think Kalahui Hawaii probably had 20,000 or so, but it's still one of the largest political organizations in history.
Was it all Wahine in their group? Was all the Wahine only?
Yeah. Yes.
Ooh.
One of the interesting things about it, and this is just I'm not judging this, I'm saying this, they had different mana'o, is that the men's group said you could have, that The non-Kanakanology could be honorary members. They couldn't be officers. Yeah.
Mm.
The women's group said non-Kanakanology women couldn't be officers, but they could be regular members. They were full members. So it's just a small difference, but the women had full members that were non-OEV. So with the women's group forms on March 27th, 1893, sorry. And one of the things I want to show you folks that is probably my favorite document in the whole world. You know, these things, you know, it's just these things come together, and when you study the history and you delve into it and you live in it, you start to feel like you know these folks, and you start to feel like you have dreams about these days and these weeks and so forth.
Mm.
And you start to understand that the pala pala, the clothes they wore, all these things were real, right? And sometimes we're connected to them through those literal. They made it through the time, and you can look at it today. Well, when the women came out with their constitution, they not only printed it in newspapers, but they made a broadside out of it. A broadside back then were these posters that you would stick, you'd put glue on the back and you stick it to the courthouse wall, stick it to the school wall, it's all, that's how you got the news out. Well, the women produced these 17.5-inch by 5-inch broadsides with their constitution, Makolelo Hawaii and Makolelo Haole, Britannia.
Oh.
There's from everyone looking, there's said to be one copy in existence in the world that left. All of them, all of them have been gone, but there's one single copy in the world today, and it's in the Lili'u collection at the Hawaii State Archives. So I was able to go down about a year ago and pull that up, and not only is it the one copy in the world, but it's the one that the women gave to the Queen and she signed on the back. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And this document was found when she was arrested in 1895. Albert Francis Judd, who was the Supreme Court Justice, and William Owen Smith, who was the Attorney General, went to Washington Place while she was arrested. She was taken away. They broke open her safe and took all of her documents out of the safe to use against her in court. And this was in her safe. So this was something that she treasured. And I want to show that to you folks in your audience.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
So two parts. So about a year ago, for the group, for the new Hui Aloha Aina, which I'm a member of, we had these reprinted. And so I want to show you what it looks like, and then I'll show you the original document in digital form. So this is, I'm just going to hold this up to the camera. So this is what we created.
Wow. Wow.
Okay. And you can see up close. Yeah. So we created this on poster board, and we made them for the members, so everyone could have one, take it home and put it on their wall. But let me show you the original. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Oop. Okay. Boom.
Oh, this is exciting. Oh, man.
You see my screen?
Aye.
Okay,
Yeah.
So this is the original, and the part that gets me, so it's Hui Hawaii Aloha Aina a me kuako ana leri, kumu kanawai, Constitution. Oyai, u ike ia ke kuporo e loa a ke kahi hui lo kahi o na mea a pau, I aloha I ka aina a me kona kuakoa. Me ka nana ole I ke ano o na au kalai aina, a me na mahele mana o paha. No laila, o mako na lere o ka pai aina.
Na lere.
In English, whereas it's necessary to obtain a compact union of all the people who love the country and its independence, irrespective of party or creed. Therefore, we, the ladies of the Hawaiian Kingdom, form ourselves into an association under the following constitution. So they were non-denominational, they were non-party. It wasn't the Tea Party or the Republicans, the Democrats. It was we, the ladies of the nation of Hawaii, come together to make this statement. And then here's the back. I'll show you the actual digital at the back. And you can see the Queen's signature.
Oh, man. Oh, my gosh. Just like cry.
Yeah, so to think that this literal one is the one she had, it was given to her by Hui Aloha Aina Wahine, and it was the one she took home and kept in her safe. Yeah, so that's for me when those pala pala kind of carry forward that voice, right?
Right. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So inspiring.
Yes, yes. Well, and it really feels like that those voices are asking you to take action, right? When it's when it keeps coming to you like that. So let me unshare my screen. Okay. So we
Wow,
have the
mahalo. That's
Oh.
Yeah.
really inspiring.
yeah.
Oh.
Maybe and just before maybe I'll put you guys on the spot real quick so and just ask you what that means to you, what this group of ladies doing that means to you. I'd like to hear it.
I cannot even talk.
Oh, okay, I'll go first. To me, it shows the solidarity. It shows the brilliance. It also shows the progressiveness of the kingdom and the respect for women. You know, even to organize on that level, to have that power, to have that say. And also, you know, something we always talk about, yeah, Kumu. And I know for here in Puna, our Vahine are so strong, you know, beginning with the original our tutu of this Aina, you know, and in this, and it seems like that's always that. And the women are always the kua, you know, the Kane might be the alo of Wanohana, but it's always the Vahine is the kua. And it just goes to show that, you know, it's always been that way. And that's part of who we truly are, you know.
I
And
think it also talks about what you know, what you said the first time that you started the show. You know, I was always the reason why I'm feeling sort of kind because I'm 60 something years old, and you're right. The history that was taught to us, you know, was basically that our kupuna sat on their hands and just let us believe that, you know, that's what they did. And looking at that document and many documents like that, just makes me even feel that, oh my gosh, they were progressive. And the women, I mean, the women especially, you know, but also, you know, the men did, I mean, it was a combination. It wasn't like this or that. It was, you know, the women's right to vote in the United States Constitution and all that history of that. We already had it.
Yeah.
We already had those kinds of stuff. And yet, you know, a lot of stuff at my learning of history and like you said, educated, you know, education wise was basically that a lot of that was clouded. This participation of political action, you know. So mahalo for bringing this, because I feel sometimes when I want to stand and, you know, I'm tired of sitting on my hands, so to speak. I mean, that's what is driving me to do Kanakanology at this time of my life, is that through educating the Kanaka of this kinds of stuff, you know, it's not that we have to ku-e about it. I mean, it's just that we know that our history and the truth of the history. And we have an archives that we can actually, you know, go into and find out. And so that's why we're going to really bug you a lot. You know, we're going to really, because this is, I mean, we're right now, 17th was yesterday.
Yeah.
But in our education and stuff like that, today I'm learning something brand new to me. I don't want to speak for everybody, but just for me. And to me, mahalo, you know, from me and my family and whoever is listening, my audience, you know, these are the kinds of stuff that we have to know. We have to know. So mahalo.
Yeah, mahalo to you, and to understand that literally weeks after this event that happened to them, they stood up and formed an organization that became the largest organization in Hawaiian history. I mean,
yeah.
and that they didn't, you know, if you think about politics internationally at that time, you know, women weren't involved in politics, and like in the United States, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, these, you know, all the different parties, women didn't get involved in that, right? And here you have them specifically not, you know, saying, oh yeah, we'll tag along with the men. They formed their own association, and they had their own goals, and they had their own statements, right?
Their own constitution.
Their own constitution.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah. So it was pretty, you know, that was pretty a strong move by them. And we'll and so, and there's another part I'm going to talk about in a minute that shows you how that continued into the 1890s.
but even your correction, let's back up a little bit. Even your correction on, you know, that one piece where, you know, we were always taught it was businessmen.
Right.
And it's like translating of the Bible, so to speak. You know, there's all these things written, right? I mean, the Bible is over there and it's written, right? And so if you have to learn about that, you got to learn Latin and Hebrew and whatever to get the gist of it, maybe. But just that little information is such a big information for me now, right now, because it's exactly what Leah said. It's like, really, they were like subjects of Hawaii. That changes my whole thing of, you know, wow.
Yeah, it wasn't let's go Germany and take over Germany. It was them going against their own nation.
Yeah, I mean, profound to me right now. I'm sorry, I'm like,
yeah. Well, talk about
reboot.
That's the definition of treason, right? That's like you've sworn an allegiance to your constitution.
That's right.
And now well, we've seen that recently, right?
Yeah.
But
woohoo, yeah. So anyway, I'm sorry to have interrupted you.
No,
continue.
No, those were perfect. So thank you. But so as we move into 1894, I think this is where, for me, Kanakanology agency or Kanakanology action in the middle of stuff was just completely washed away and needs to be understood. So about 8 years ago, Dr. Osorio, when I was still in school, Dr. Osorio, my kumu, asked me, I met with him one day and he asked me to write, he said, you know, he was always crazy busy. And he asked me one day, he said, Ron, I need you to write something about, I'm doing this thing about famous documents in Hawaiian history. He goes, I want you to write about the Republic Constitution of 1894. You know, and kumu asks you, you do it, right? But I was kind of bummed.
Yes.
Right. But I was kind of bummed because I was like, oh man, that's the Howley document, right? It's like all these great documents to write about, and I got to write about the Howley document, right? and so I started to dive into it. And so what this was the provisional government. So one of the top lawyers on constitutional law in the United States was named Thomas Cooley. Yeah, he was the Supreme Court Justice for the state of Michigan. He was the president of the American Bar Association, and he was referred to by the New York Times and other places as the top constitutional lawyer in America. Okay, he came out and said in 1893, he said, absolutely no annexation can take place because this is a provisional government. A provisional government is just like it says, it's a temporary government. It doesn't have the power to enact treaties and things like that. So he said, as a provisional government, they can't do anything. So even if that first constitution would have went through, he's claiming it wouldn't have been legal. So provisional government understands this. They understand that they can't be provisional forever. So now they've got to form a permanent government. But they're a tiny minority. You know, this is another fact that we just really got to drill into folks' heads. You're talking about 3 or 4% of the population, right? And everyone else is against them. So they can't have a vote, right? They can't do anything democratic, but the world is watching. And England, Japan, the United States now is all saying, you're not legitimate. So how are we going to create a legitimate, thinking of Thurston guys, how are we going to create a legitimate government that looks legitimate, but lets us keep power, right? And so they say, well, we'll create a republic. When a republic is one of the most democratic forms of a nation, right? But we can't really have a republic. And I wrote an article about this. It's hopefully will be published pretty soon. But they really, there's tons of evidence showing that they had these meetings. They tried to figure out the best way to do it. How do we keep being an oligarchy, but pretend to be a republic? W.D. Alexander, who's the historian for the republic or the provisional government, writes that we should model it on the state constitution for Alabama, which completely disenfranchised blacks, right?
Of course. Obvious.
Right, right. So they're going to have a constitutional convention to create to create a constitution. But again, you can't let just anybody be a delegate. They say we're going to elect people to the constitutional convention. Great. So Hawaiians are majority. They'll win. They'll go in there and write a new constitution. But they say in that thing, number one, they disenfranchise again all Asians. So Asians aren't allowed to vote. And they say you have to take an oath of allegiance to the republic and swear that you will never support monarchy or the restitution of the queen ever again, right? So it's like having an election in the United States and saying you can only vote Democratic. To be able to vote, you can only vote Republican. You know, it's just ridiculous. So most Hawaiians refuse to vote. And so, but not only was that one way they kept power, but they also made sure that nothing would happen by they had 18 elected delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And they had some that they're going to appoint from the current government to automatically be delegates. You know how many those were? 19. So they had an automatic majority of government officials in that Constitutional Convention. So 19 appointed delegates that were their own people, and 18 elected that were from people that, you know, weren't Hawaiians. And that group, that ridiculous group, comes together as 37 delegates, and they write a constitution, right? The constitution they wrote, now, doing the research for this article, I looked at international papers, I looked at US papers and so forth. They said, we're going to appoint the president of the new republic. They're going to allow non-citizens who supported the provisional government to vote. And super importantly, now this gets a little complicated here, but it's such an important point to make. There were many foreigners in Hawaii who were supportive of the idea of annexation. I'm talking about Americans, I'm talking about Germans, I'm talking about other people who were whites, who were supportive of the annexation, but didn't want to become members of the republic because they were scared they'd lose their citizenship back home. Right? Lots of people have talked about dual citizenship in the kingdom, and most of it's been incorrect. But the bottom line is, citizenship is not there's no international law on that. It's up to each country to decide whether they give you those rights or not, right? So for an example, my friend today he's a French American citizen. He's American. He married a French woman and got French citizenship. When he goes to France, he can use either passport. They don't care. But when he comes back into America, he has to use his American passport because America won't recognize his French passport, right? It's up to each country to choose whether they recognize. The United States had specifically said to this question, the Secretary of the Foreign Affairs in America had written that if anyone takes allegiance to the kingdom, they will not retain their rights as an American citizen, right? So you have all these white folks who want to support the republic, but can't because they'll lose their citizenship, right? So the republic created something called, in their constitution, special rights of citizenship. And they said, if you can prove that you supported the provisional government, and if you want to support us and so forth, we'll give you the rights of citizenship, but you won't actually be a citizen. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's absurd, right? So you're not really a citizen. So you don't actually become a citizen. So you don't endanger your citizenship back home, but you get to vote and do those things that you want to here.
Oh, it's just a loophole so that they could include the other white people.
Exactly.
The vote.
And a little side note I'll blow the punchline of my article here, but you know who 2/3 of the special rights of citizenship went to? Who was the big white group in Hawaii that they could pull in to vote to support them and so forth?
Was it Michigan?
It was the Portuguese.
Oh, the Portuguese.
Yeah. Over 2/3 of the special rights of citizenship went to Portuguese, and so they doubled. So that election,
the Lunas on the plantation, huh?
So they had 2,000 votes in there in May. The election they had later was 5,000 votes. So they're trying to look more inclusive. They're trying to look like, look, we're being democratic, but they're just letting in the folks they want to let in, right?
Right.
So all of those things, and so to get to the point, all of those things, the ridiculousness of having a majority appointed, the ridiculousness of appointing a president instead of electing one, the ridiculousness of that the people don't have to approve the Constitution, the ridiculousness of special rights of citizenship, All of those things they had to do because of Kanakanology action. Because Hawaiians had organized, formed an organization, called them out in the papers every day, had mass meetings, petitioned the US Congress. Because Hawaiians were active politically, they couldn't help. They were forced to make a constitution that was absurd, that left marks in that timeline for us to discover 100 years later and show how it was ridiculous. If Kanakanology would have been quiet, wouldn't have been a problem. They would have just said okay and had a regular constitution. But they had to create this absurd constitution because of the action of Kanakanology.
It demonstrates the power of, and the resistance. It's
Right.
another evidence of the resistance that they were facing, that it wasn't like Kumu, like you were saying, sitting on their hands. They were under so much pressure that they had to be that ridiculous.
Exactly. So it's unspoken voice, right? It's this pressure that's out there that you don't hear and see, but that's why you have to do this, right? It's that forced absurdity. So and people called them out. So when that constitution came out, everybody said, what a ridiculous constitution and so forth. So again, it was this culture of insecurity. You know, one of the dangers or one of the fallbacks of that fatal impact narrative, of just looking at the events as tragic and victimization, is that you wipe away Kanaka action, right? We think of, oh, these white men dominated the landscape and so forth. They were scared crapless. I'm trying to be not cursed, but they.
Yeah.
I mean, you have this.
They were vulnerable. They were actually vulnerable.
And they were absolutely. They were lawyers. There's one of them writes, I forget which one, but one of them writes a memo to the rest of them, and he says, "You guys understand what we're doing, don't you? If this doesn't work, we've committed the epitome of treason, and the penalty for treason in every country in the world is death." So you have this small group of white men counting on this working. It didn't work. Now they're shuffling to do something else, and they're scared for their lives. So it wasn't this powerful 10 million missionary party. One other way I'll make a point of that, and I might have said this last time, but I'll bring it up again, is that this gentleman from HPU, historian, wrote an article a few years ago, and he talked about missionaries in Hawaii. And he was talking about missionaries in the Civil War. And he said, in his article, he said there were 5,000 missionary families during the Civil War in Hawaii. There weren't 500. There were 117 total missionaries sent to Hawaii over the course of that century, right? So we tend to have this idea that they were everywhere and they were in charge, and there was 13 Kanaka for every one haole, right?
Well, even like when you're saying that ABCFM said that, okay, Paul, you guys did good already. So the churches and the Christianization wasn't white led at that point already, yeah.
Right. And so it becomes, I mean, yeah, and that's my dissertation, is that Hawaiians claimed Christianity and actually used it as their central tool to fight against annexation later. I mean,
right.
Where do you think they signed the anti-annexation petitions? In the churches. Every
churches.
Every church had a Hui Aloha Aina group. Every deacon in the church was a member of Hui Aloha Aina. James Kaulia, the president of Hui Aloha Aina, his father was a deacon at Kamakapili.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you think, because like something, I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but I'm just thinking like, why didn't they just kill these guys? You know, I mean, why not resort to violence when it's kind of a small group?
Right.
Maybe it was that Christianity factor. I don't know. Well, I don't know. That's not necessarily a trend of Christianity, but you know, what do you think it is?
It's a great question. So there were memos that went around, there were ideas that went around that included, and I don't like to, promote this, but there were ideas that went around, including there were a few Hawaiians who said in the weeks after the overthrow, all we have to do is bomb Central Union Church on a Sunday and we'll take out 2/3 of them. Because
I mean, I don't know. It's
okay.
Yeah.
But
violence is bad. I just want to say violence is bad, but also
I see that in your eyes. But to be honest, it was the Queen, and it was Joseph Kapoli and those others saying, you have to understand, we have the advantage of looking back.
Right.
In 1893 and 1894, they were convinced it was gonna work. And that's when I remember in 107, when I used to teach 107 in Hawaiian Studies, there was one year when I was teaching and it just clicked for me. I'm like, oh my God, like they almost won. Like we came within hours of there being a restoration of the Queen in November of 1893, right?
Right, that's right. That's a good point, is that their plan was working.
The plan, well,
Even up to the Ku'e petition in 87.
And it makes sense. Right, and it makes sense that it's gonna work, right? So all you have to do, if this happens, all you have to do is get word out to the world how ridiculous this is, and they'll fix it. And the Queen believed that. And she wasn't naive, she was almost correct. It was two things. It was number one, them putting it all, it was, well, in 1893, 94, the problem was no nation, people always say, oh, we had a treaty with that nation, we had a treaty with this nation. Treaties only mean so much as people are willing to back them up. And no nation was going to go to war with the United States to help this small country in the Pacific. Yeah.
Right.
So, and then in 1997, 98, the thing that happened was the Spanish-American War. No question. They couldn't pass it. Hawaiians defeated the second treaty of annexation, period. Done. But then the military came in and said, we have to take Hawaii. I don't care how we do it. I don't care right or wrong.
Yeah.
We have to take Hawaii. They always call that the Spanish-American War, which is a misnomer. The Spanish-American War lasted a few months.
Yeah.
That was the American-Filipino War. It went on for 7 or 8 years where they killed over 1 million Filipinos.
Yeah.
And the only way you can do that is by having Hawaii as a coaling station to the Pacific.
I see. So it wasn't so much Hawaii's internal action. It was more about this America doing its new imperialism trip.
Right. It was geopolitics. But having said that, it wasn't a foregone conclusion. The Queen was absolutely right she was almost right. She was almost right.
That helps me understand. Mahalo. Because it's something when my students ask, I'm just like, well, violence is bad, and like, gotta be pono, but no, that makes more sense. Thank you. No, I know what to say.
No, it was akamai of her. It was the right thing to do. Right. It was a pono thing to do. And also, don't get it wrong. Hawaiians were preparing. I mean, one of my favorite stories is there's the pastor in Ka'anapali, Maui. His name was I forget his name, but he was the pastor. He was the pastor for the church in Ka'anapali, Maui. One of the other things that's hard to think about and discuss is that the PG and the Republic had native spies. They had Hawaiians who were paid to go to the Huiloha meetings and come back to them and report.
The compradors.
Yeah. And one of the spies for Maui came back and said, that reverend in Kanapali is the one who's the member of Huiloha Aina who's in charge of importing guns and weapons. So they were, Hawaiians were preparing if it didn't work. They were gathering guns, they were having a plan, they were doing all kinds of stuff. Right. The problem on that end was that the Republic had spies, and they kind of knew what was going on. That's what stopped the Wilcox Rebellion. They knew it was coming. That's why they went out ahead of it and arrested Navahi and Bush and those guys in '94. But as far as the legal thing to do, as far as the right thing to do, as far as the smart thing to do, that's exactly, they did what they were supposed to do. It wasn't naive. The United States almost acted the right way the first time. Whereas, and that's important to note too, is that I have friends who've actually gone to Cleveland's home Cleveland's burial in Tennessee or whatever, and honored him and so forth. And I'm not saying they shouldn't, to each his own, but Cleveland chose not to follow through and restore the Queen. People say, he gave it to Congress. Well, he didn't have to give it to Congress. He had the power to say, reinstate the Queen now. So he kind of let the nation down at that point.
But then you have to also remember the context, that is he as a sitting American president gonna like they were relying on that preference for white supremacy,
right? Well, and
white people,
right? Well, and there's two. Well, I think there's two parts to that. There was a strong, of course, America, you can't talk about America as a single entity, right? It's
Right.
like today, look how divided Hawaii is, or America is today.
Mhm.
At that time in America, there was a strong anti-imperialist movement. There was a strong, movement against all of this.
Mhm.
But you're right in the fact that I think Cleveland decided not to because it would be very, very bad for him politically.
Right.
So, and Hawaii was one of the things on his plate, right? He had several other things he was dealing with. So he didn't follow through then. The last thing I know we're running out of time, so the last thing I'll mention is that
Oh, shucks.
Dang it.
Well, we'll come back to you again.
it's I promise I don't look to glorify these things. I mean, that's part of my role as a historian is to not get too, I get excited when I find stuff I like to find, but I really, really, really want to understand the truth as clean as I can, as clear as I can. And so when I say that women had a leading role in this, like, I'm not making that up. It's obvious, it's apparent. Like you said earlier, you said the women of Puna, right? I remember Dr. Trask always say, the women are leading our movement in the 70s, because it was Dr. Kame'elehiva, it was, so forth, and back then you look at this history and you start to see these remarkable events. So after the supposed annexation in 1898, my big question was, what happens to Hui Aloha at that point, right? So they've been fighting for 5 years to stop annexation, and now this supposed annexation happened, this occupation starts. So now we're going to have the first, so 1900, the territory begins, and the Organic Acts have said we're going to have a free and fair election. So this is the first time since 93 that everybody's gotten to vote. Not Asians, so I shouldn't say everybody, but Hawaiians without any income clause, without any swearing allegiance. So there's going to be a semi-democratic vote for the first time in 5 years. So how are Hawaiians going to respond to that? So the two parties are the Democrats and the Republicans coming into that election. Now, America makes sure that they don't give up too much power because the executive branch is appointed by the President of the United States, right?
Right.
Governor Dole, Governor so-and-so. The governor and the president appoint the judiciary, but the legislature is going to be elected. So 1/3 of Hawaii is going to actually be representative, other than the fact that the Asians are disallowed. So Hawaiians, instead of joining the Democrats or Republicans, they form their own political party. Okay, cool. Okay, Au Kua Ko Homerula, the Home Rule Party, right? And we're talking about an incredible political achievement because you've had, since 1898, since the beginning of the occupation, since this push towards this territorial status, since you had this guy who was a Grand Master Ku Klux Klan create the territorial acts, there's been this rush of money and power and political influence in Hawaii that solidified white hegemony, that solidified this white rule. In the face of that, without a political party to start, without money, without any things, Hawaiians band together in the course of 5 months, create a political party, the Home Rule Party, that wins that election by a landslide. They defeat the Republican Party, they defeat the Democratic Party, and they dominate that election, right? The Home Rule Party. Yeah. And it's and so you go back and you start looking at how they do that. They call it, so at this point, again, the Democrats, the Republicans, they're having political talks, around town. They're having, speeches and so forth, and this guy and so forth. And their women, again, aren't anywhere near the action in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It's all men. The Home Rule Party had its convening organizational convention in 3 different cities. One was included Laie, which gets into some really interesting. Laie was an incredible hotspot for royalty. It was the women of the Relief Society, the Mormon women, who actually went against their church and got political and supported the Queen. But that convention that created delegates to form a constitution for that political party was made up of men and women. And there were 3 elected women to that constitutional convention. Which was unheard of. So one of them was a woman named Kaluapalawa Kama from Laie. And there's 2 others. And they were drafters of that constitution of the political party. The party goes forward. It's organizing on every island. They come out to Maui and they tell them, they have a meeting in Maui at the courthouse and they say, okay, so we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And the women and the men wrote in their journals. They said the women showed up at the courthouse and said, we got this. Don't worry about it. And the women went out and organized the party in Haiku, in Paia, upcountry Maui. That was all done by women. And they organized the Ku'uko'ome Party. And this election also, besides the legislature, it's also electing that first delegate to the US Congress, right? And it ends up being Wilcox. Wilcox was the independent home rule guy. Right. They have rallies downtown. One of them, there's so many like incredibly meaningful, like prophetic instances. The Chinatown fire happens, right?
Right.
Wipes out Chinatown. The church that Kalakaua built, Kaumakapili. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Kaumakapili, when it created its second building, the leaders of the church designed the building and ran it by Kalakaua, and he said, no, it should be like this. It should be 2 spires, and it should be this and this and this. And so it was built the way Kalakaua wanted to be built. When it was dedicated, Princess Lili'u was the one who dedicated Kaumakapili Church, and she put images of her and the other ali'i in the cornerstone of the church at Kaumakapili. Well, Kaumakapili has burned now, and it's if you've seen the photographs, it's one wall of cement that's left standing, and a little bit of a roof. They held the meeting for the Ku'uko'ome Rula at the church, at the burned out church, and Kalua Palawa Kama opened the meeting with a speech. Democratic men, Republican men, women had never opened a political meeting and spoken on behalf of the candidates. These women followed Wilcox around and spoke for him at all of the meetings. So they were central to that organization. They come into power. The first thing they do is go into every government office and department there is and say what's been going on, what needs help, and so forth, right? The Marshal's office, the Bureau of Education, and so forth. And they planned this legislative agenda that would kind of, bring back the nation. And the fascinating thing about it is, this is something that always almost gets me choked up, but it's, I should stop prefacing everything I say, but I really want folks to understand that when I get excited about these things because despite my trying to find the good and the bad, you find these things that are just purely good, and you go, frick, like these folks were incredible. So after 8 years, after 8 years or 7 years of losing the nation, of being portrayed as monkeys in the newspaper, of all of these horrific things being done to them by the powers that be, they came into power in 1901 and passed bills and laws that helped the nation, not just Hawaiians. And that just, yeah. I mean, it was, so one of the bills they passed in 1901 in the first territorial legislature was a bill to reimburse the Chinese for their losses in the Chinatown fire, which hadn't happened under the old government. And remember, the Chinese didn't have a vote. So there was zero political gain to doing this.
It was just a Pono thing to do. Exactly.
And they said, no matter what our economy is, no matter now we're in charge of the purse strings, we're going to do the right thing. And they passed bills like that. They passed a bill saying that all, not just Hawaiians, all people who have taro lands can take those lands off their taxes. All the implements used to grow taro, you can take that off your taxes. They're tax-free. So they're encouraging the growing of taro again. They were encouraging the study abroad program to send youth around the world. All of these things. They're encouraging the use of Hawaiian language again. The problem with that legislature was that the governor vetoed all those bills that they passed, and they were one vote short of a 2/3 majority to pass it. But if you want to, as somebody outside of the fray, if you want somebody from, Tennessee to come and look at this history and give their opinion on it, they're going to be blown away by how much was done to Hawaiians and how they responded in a Pono way.
Resilience and the resilience.
They never gave up fighting. They never gave up demanding, but they did it for the sake of having power to use it in the right way. And And that's the story of 1893.
Yeah, it's really a story of integrity.
Yeah,
Of
integrity.
maintaining your integrity at in any, you know, where I'm just like, well, not me, but you know, why not just kill them, right? It's that
Right.
it wasn't that wouldn't have maintained their integrity in the same way.
Right. Well, and it's not for me to judge, but I do say that we all should think about that when we're doing the things we're saying and doing today, right?
Right.
They weren't just, I saw, pardon my language again, but I saw a post today that said, and I'm not sharing my opinion of the current president or past president. I'm talking about this one person posted a thing and it said, fuck Biden. There's a big flag that said, fuck Biden, go to hell. And then I click on the guy's thing and it's like, he's got a master's degree in theology from Saint So-and-so's university. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, like you're a pastor, like, wait a minute, And so it's that thing of looking, and I think that's the value again in those histories. Bring those pono actions of these dozens and dozens and hundreds of men and women to our keiki, right? To our Haman. That it's not just let us take power so that we can kick their ass.
Right.
Let us create a just society again. And I think that's the lesson that Hawaiians show us from 1893 to 1900.
And I think too, it also takes away that idea of that victimhood.
Yes.
That they were not just victims of this, that they were continuously organizing and effectively organizing. Effectively. I mean,
there's victories there, again and again and again. You can look back and show kids that the Hawaiians did this and it was successful. You can show kids how that organization happened.
Getting back to going back to Lili'u, right, and her stance of, she could have done, right, and she didn't, for the purpose that she wanted to do the truth. She was so set on looking at this from that perspective versus one of malice, one of, that kind of action. And I think so that it showed to me now in 2021, sitting here and listening to that it wasn't just her actions, but the way that the people at that time also showed that same similar type of action by taking action.
Right.
So to me, it gives me as a person today, a Kanaka today, that, there is hope. There is hope in truth. There's still hope in truth. And there's a lot of fact finding that is still out there for us to do. But, I'm looking at life through a different lens now as what I do and contribute to that and honor, the things that our kupuna at that time have done already and showed us that there is a way to do this. And what it inspires me to remember is that it's like this thing that if you can lift, if one Kanaka can stand, everybody benefits. But they have to have that inside to look back at our history and say, what is good for our kupuna at that time, the way that they thought through everything, the way that they took the system that they had to work with and still hold on to their majesty, in a sense, their majestic self.
Yeah.
And that to me is what I take away from tonight's Ike. So wow.
Yeah, me too. It's that sense that there is something there that is good, that is Pono, right? It's like
Mhm.
when the Home Rule Party broke up, when they were creating their plan of what to do, the Queen had signed an oath in '95 to not be involved in politics, right? And she'd gone on sitting at Washington Place, but they break up their convention at noon and they march over to her house and say, you know, we want to hear your voice. And she was overcome. She was like, I thought you guys had forgotten me, and da 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 da. But it's like they didn't need to do that. It wasn't the pragmatic thing to do. It wasn't the legal thing to do.
Mhm.
That's what you
Mhm.
do, right? Is you go talk to your elite,
Yeah.
those who
Mhm.
played you before. So it's that way of living that is Kanakanology. It's that
Mhm.
way of understanding what is Pono. Because otherwise, you know, it's just this football game of we win and then they win and then we win and then they win. But who cares who wins if you're not creating a Pono society, right?
Mhm.
So that's what I'm so impressed by those people, is that that's what they were constantly trying to do.
And was it that you know, I mean, that in itself, what you just said about them going over to her hale,
Uh-huh.
you know, that to me is like, you know, like you said, you know, she felt abandoned. You know, she felt, and then they come over there and they do that. And so, you know, when I think about Lili'u, I always think about from the 1901 to 1917 when she passes, you know, and I just, I mean, I cannot imagine. And I really don't want to imagine. I really want to know
Yeah.
what was her position? Where was she? What was she doing? You know, I just feel like, you know, that was one thing that I've always thought about. Like, did she feel that she abandoned us? Did she feel like we abandoned her? You know, I mean, what was going on with her during that, after that 1901
Right. Well,
time, you know?
when this COVID thing settles down, you can
Yeah.
fly Oahu and come to the archives, and I will show you her actual letters. You can
Oh,
Oh, we gotta
oh, we
go
have to
for
see, but you can.
But in the meantime, join us
Yeah.
next month on Kanakanology.
You're gonna throw some palu at us, right?
Yes, yes. Well, because there is, I mean, there's me telling a story, and there's looking at her handwriting, right? It's just so
Oh
effective.
yeah, it's just so.
Yeah, she wrote
Okapala.
she wrote a series of letters to Mrs. Navahi that are one of the most incredible kind of untapped collections that I know are out there. It's about 48 different letters. Mrs. Navahi would write her, and every letter is kind of a different greeting, and it was back and forth through those years. They're Mako Hawaii, and they've been translated.
Wow.
But I think the Myers and those folks are working on doing something with them. But
Mm.
there's so much stuff out there. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
And you know what?
Wow.
I'm
Go
interesting.
ahead.
I was just gonna say the what's really interesting for me, and I'm non-Christian. I'm Buddhist. I'm non-theist. But what's interesting for me is her sincere, and the more I read from her sincere belief in Christianity and her search to not give that up once those guys who had just taught her overthrew her, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's baptized Anglican, she's baptized Mormon, and she takes it seriously, but she always has this spirituality that pervades everything she does, and so that's interesting in those years. After.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. It's amazing. That's amazing.
Always fun to talk with you too.
Oh, thank you so much for your time.
Oh
It's such an
yeah,
honor.
always full when you call talking with us. Oh my gosh, it just mahalo.
No, I'm glad to.
Yeah, mahalo nui for sharing this, especially this week in this important times, as we honor 128 years
Mm-hmm.
of this era of struggle in the Hawaiian Nation. And I think it's just so grateful to really have the opportunity to get a better understanding of what really went down and how it went down. And it does change how, you know, even as an Aloha Aina today, you know, how you really understand those events and what it really meant, and our kuleana now. And it just
Mhm.
is very validating, yeah, Kumu.
Yes,
That
it's very,
like, you know, it's this, we all, you know, this is the path that was behind us and also still ahead of us, you know.
Right.
Mahalo
yeah.
nui.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much.
No.
Okay.
So, Pao?
Okay, okay. Ahui ho kako, leave
Ahui ho
messages and comments.
kako.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Bye. Ahui ho.